Hello, fifth grade readers. You're joining me for the end of chapter 9 and the beginning of chapter 10. Remember, we left Harry, Hermione, and Ron hiding in the forest because a bunch of Death Eaters had taken over the camp and started messing with the Muggles. They saw that there was a dark mark that was shot into the sky, and right now they're trying to run away from it because it's the signature of death. Somebody has died, according to Voldemort. That's what they said. "What's the matter?" Harry said, startled to see her face so white and terrified. "It's the dark mark, Harry," Hermione moaned, pulling him so hard that she could get him to move. "You know whose sign." "And she had one," said Mr. Diggory. "I found her holding one too, Ludo. If it's all right with you, Mr. Crouch, I think we should hear what she's got to say for herself." Crouch gave no sign that he had heard Mr. Diggory, but Mr. Diggory seemed to take his silence for assent. He raised his own wand and pointed it at Winky. "Reneverate!" Winky stirred feebly. Her great brown eyes opened, and she blinked several times in a bemused sort of way. Watched by the silent wizard, she raised herself shakily into a sitting position. She caught sight of Mr. Diggory's feet, and slowly, tremulously, raised her eyes to stare into his face. Then, more slowly still, she looked up into the sky. Harry could see the floating skull reflected twice in her enormous glassy eyes. She gave a gasp, looked wildly around the crowd, which was clearing and bursting into sobs. "Elf," said Mr. Diggory sternly, "you know who I am, don't you? I'm a member of the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures." Winky began to rock back and forwards on the ground, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Harry was reminded forcibly of Dobby in these moments of terrified disobedience. "As you see, Elf, the dark mark was conjured here a short while ago," said Mr. Diggory, "and you were observed moments later right beneath it. An explanation, if you please." I is not doing it, sir," Winky gasped. "I is not knowing how, sir." "You were found with a wand in your hand," barked Mr. Diggory, brandishing it in the front of her. And as the wand caught green, the light that was filling the sky from the skull above, Harry recognized it. "Hey, that's mine," he said. Everyone in the clearing looked at him. "Excuse me?" said Mr. Diggory incredulously. "That's my wand," said Harry. "I dropped it." "You dropped it?" repeated Mr. Diggory in disbelief. "Is this a confession? You threw it aside after you conjured the mark?" "Amos, think who you're talking to," said Mr. Weasley, very angry. "This is Harry Potter. Do you think he's likely to conjure the dark mark?" Of course not," mumbled Mr. Diggory. "Sorry, I got carried away." "I didn't drop it there anyway," said Harry, jerking his thumb towards the trees beneath the skull. "I missed it right after we got into the wood." "So," said Mr. Diggory, his eyes hardening as he turned to look at Winky again, cowering at his feet. "You found this wand, eh, Elf? And then you picked it up, and you thought you'd have some fun with it, did you?" "I is not doing magic with it, sir," squealed Winky, tears streaming from the sides of her squashed and bulbous nose. I is just picking it up, sir. I is not making the dark mark, sir. I is not knowing how." "It wasn't her," said Hermione. She looked very nervous, yet determined all the same. Winky's got a squeaky little voice, and the voice we heard doing the incantation was much deeper." She looked round at Harry and Ron, appealing for their support. "It didn't sound anything like Winky, did it?" "No," said Harry, shaking his head. "It definitely didn't sound like an elf." "Yeah, it was a human voice," said Ron. "Well, we'll soon see," growled Mr. Diggory, looking unimpressed. "There's a simple way for discovering the last spell a wand performed, Elf. Did you know that?" Winky trembled and shook her head frantically, her ears flapping, as Mr. Diggory raised his own wand again and placed it to the tip of Harry's. "Prior incantato!" roared Mr. Diggory. Harry heard Hermione gasp horrified as a gigantic serpent-tongued skull erupted from the point where the two wands met, but it was a mere shadow of a green skull high above them. It looked as though it was made of gray smoke, the ghost of a spell. Deletrius! Mr. Diggory shouted, and the smoky skull vanished in a wisp of smoke. "So," said Mr. Diggory with a kind of savage triumph, looking down upon Winky, who was shaking convulsively, I is not doing it, she squealed, her eyes rolling in terror. I is not, knowing how. I is a good house elf. I isn't using wands. I isn't even knowing how. You've been caught red-handed, elf, Mr. Diggory roared, caught with the guilty wand in your hand. Amos, said Mr. Weasley loudly, think about it. Precious few wizards know how to do that spell. Where would she have learnt it? Perhaps Amos is suggesting, said Mr. Crouch, cold anger in every syllable, that I routinely teach my servants to conjure the dark mark. There was a deeply unpleasant silence. Amos Diggory looked horrified. Mr. Crouch, no, not at all, not at all. You have now come very close to accusing the two people in this clearing who are least likely to conjure the mark, barked Mr. Crouch. Harry Potter and myself. I suppose you are familiar with the boy's story, Amos? Of course, everyone knows, muttered Mr. Diggory, looking highly discomfited. And I trust you remember the many proofs I have given over a long career that I despise and detest the dark arts and those who practice them, Mr. Crouch shouted, his eyes bulging again. Mr. Crouch, I never suggested you knew it or had anything to do with it, muttered Amos Diggory, now reddening behind his scrubby brown beard. If you accuse my elf, you accuse me, Diggory, shouted Mr. Crouch. Where else would she have learned to conjure it? She might have picked it up anywhere. Precisely, Amos, said Mr. Weasley. She might have picked it up anywhere. Winky, he said, turning kindly to the elf, but she flinched as if he too were shouting at her. Where exactly did you find Harry's wand? Winky was twisting the hem of her tea towel so violently that it was fraying beneath her fingers. I is finding it there, sir, she whispered. There, in the tree, sir. You see, Amos, said Mr. Weasley. Whoever conjured the mark could have disapparated right after they'd done it, leaving Harry's wand behind. A clever thing to do, not using their own wand, which could have betrayed them. And Winky, here, had the misfortune to come across the wand moments later and pick it up. But then she'd have been feet away from the real culprit, said Mr. Diggory impatiently. Elf, did you see anyone? Winky began to tremble worse than ever. Her giant eyes flickered from Mr. Diggory to Ludo Bagman and to Barty Crouch. Then she gulped and said, I is seeing no one, sir. No one. Amos, said Mr. Crouch curtly, I am fully aware in the ordinary course of events you would want to take Winky into your department for questioning. I ask you, however, to allow me to deal with her. Mr. Diggory looked as though he didn't think much of this suggestion at all, but it was too clear that Harry that Mr. Crouch was such an important member of the ministry that he did not dare refuse him. You may rest assured that she will be punished, Mr. Crouch added coldly. Master, stammered Winky, looking up at Mr. Crouch, her eyes brimming with tears. Master, please. Mr. Crouch stared back, his face somehow sharpened, each line upon it more deeply etched. There was no pity in his gaze. Winky has behaved tonight in a manner I would not have believed possible, he said slowly. I told her to remain in the tent. I told her to stay there while I went to sort out the trouble. And I find that she disobeyed me. This means clothes. No, shrieked Winky, prostrating herself at Mr. Crouch's feet. No, master, not clothes, not clothes. Harry knew that the only way to turn the house elf free was to present them with proper garments. It was pitiful to see the way Winky clutched at her tea towel as she sobbed over Mr. Crouch's feet. But she was frightened, Hermione burst out angrily, glaring at Mr. Crouch. Your elf is scared of heights, and those wizards in masks were levitating people. You can't blame her for wanting to get out of their way. Mr. Crouch took a step backwards, freeing himself from contact with the elf, whom he was surveying as though she was something filthy and rotten that was contaminating his overshined shoes. I have no use for a house elf who disobeys me, he said coldly, looking at Hermione. I have no use for a servant who forgets what is due to her master and to her master's reputation. Winky was crying so hard that her sobs echoed around the clearing. There was a very nasty silence, which was ended by Mr. Weasley, who said quietly, Well, I think I'll take my lot back to the tent, then, if nobody's got any objections. Amos, that wand's told us all it can. If Harry could have it back, please. Mr. Diggory handed Harry his wand and pocketed it. Come on now, you three, said Mr. Weasley. but Hermione didn't seem to want to move. Her eyes were still upon the sobbing elf. "Hermione!" Mr. Weasley said more urgently. She turned and followed Harry and Ron out of the clearing and off into the trees. "What's going to happen to Winky?" said Hermione, the moment they had left the clearing. "I don't know," said Mr. Weasley. "The way they were treating her," said Hermione furiously. "Mr. Diggory calling her elf all the time, and Mr. Crouch! He knows she didn't do it, and he's still going to sack her. He didn't care how frightened she'd been or how upset she was. It was like she wasn't even human." "Well, she's not," said Ron. Hermione rounded on him. "That doesn't mean she hasn't got any feelings, Ron. It's disgusting the way—" "Hermione, I agree with you," said Mr. Weasley, beckoning her on. "But now is not the time to discuss elf rights. I want to get back to the tent as fast as we can. What happened to the others?" "We lost them in the dark," said Ron. "Dad, why was everyone so uptight about that school thing?" "I'll explain everything back at the tent," said Mr. Weasley tensely. But when they reached the edge of the wood, their progress was impeded. A large crowd of frightened-looking witches and wizards was congregated there, and when they saw Mr. Weasley coming towards them, many of them surged forward. "What's going on? Who conjured it? Arthur, it's not him." "Of course it's not him," said Mr. Weasley impatiently. "We don't know who it was. It looks like they disapparated. Now please, excuse me. I want to get to bed." He led Harry, Ron, Hermione, and the rest of the crowd back to the campsite. All was quiet there. There was no sign of masked wizards, though several ruined tents were still smoking. Charlie's head was poking out of the boys' tent. "Dad, what's going on?" he called through the dark. Fred, George, and Ginny got back okay, but the others— "I've got them here," said Mr. Weasley, bending down and entering the tent. Harry, Ron, and Hermione entered after him. Bill was sitting at the small kitchen table, holding a bedsheet to his arm, which was bleeding profusely. Charlie had a large rip in his shirt, and Percy was sporting a bloody nose. Fred, George, and Ginny looked unhurt, though shaken. "Did you get him, Dad?" said Bill sharply. "The person who conjured the dark mark?" "No," said Mr. Weasley. "We found Barty Crouch's elf holding Harry's wand, but we're none the wiser about who actually conjured the mark." "What?" said Bill, Charlie, and Percy together. "Harry's wand?" said Fred. "Mr. Crouch's elf?" said Percy, sounding thunderstruck. With some assistance from Harry, Ron, and Hermione, Mr. Weasley explained what had happened in the woods. When they had finished their story, Percy swelled indignantly. "Well, Mr. Crouch is right to get rid of an elf like that," he said. "Running away when he expressly told her not to, embarrassing him in front of the whole ministry. How would that have looked if she had been up in front of the Department of Regulation and Magical Control?" "She didn't do anything. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time," Hermione snapped at Percy, who looked very taken aback. Hermione had always gotten on fairly well with Percy, better indeed than any of the others. "Hermione, a wizard in Mr. Crouch's position can't afford a house elf who's going to run amok with a wand," said Percy pompously, recovering himself. "She didn't run amok," shouted Hermione. "She just picked it up off the ground." "Look, can someone explain what that skull thing was?" said Ron impatiently. "It wasn't hurting anyone. Why is it such a big deal?" "I told you. You know whose symbol, Ron," said Hermione, before anyone else could answer. "I read it in the Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts. And it hasn't been seen for 13 years, said Mr. Weasley quietly. Of course, people panicked. It was almost like seeing you-know-who back again. "I don't get it," said Ron, frowning. "I mean, it's still only a shape in the sky." "You-know-who and his followers sent the dark mark into the air whenever they killed," said Mr. Weasley. "The terror it inspired. You have no idea. You're too young. Just picture coming home and finding the dark mark hovering above your house, and knowing what you're about to find inside." Mr. Weasley winced. Everyone's worst fear. The very worst. There was silence for a moment. Then Bill, removing the sheet from his arm to check his cut, said, "Well, it didn't help us tonight. Whoever conjured it scared the Death Eaters away the moment they saw it. They all disapparated before we got near enough to unmask any of them. We caught the Robertses before they hit the ground, though. They're having their memories modified right now." "Death Eaters?" said Harry. "What are Death Eaters?" "It's what you-know-whose supporters called themselves," said Bill. "I think we saw what's left of them tonight. The ones who managed to keep themselves out of Azkaban, anyway." "We can't prove it was them, Bill," said Mr. Weasley. Though it probably was, he added hopelessly. Yeah, I bet it was, said Ron suddenly. Dad, we met Draco in the woods, and he told us that his dad was one of those nutters in masks, and we all know the Malfoys were right with you-know-who. But what were Voldemort's supporters? Harry began. Everyone flinched. Like most of the wizarding world, the Weasleys always avoided saying Voldemort's name. Sorry, said Harry quickly. What were you-know-who's supporters up to, levitating muggles, I mean? What was the point? The point? Said Mr. Weasley with a hollow laugh. Harry, that's our idea of fun. Half the muggle killings back when you-know-who was in power were done for fun. I suppose they had a few drinks tonight and couldn't resist reminding us all that lots of them are still at large. A nice little reunion for them, he finished disgustedly. But if they were Death Eaters, why did they disapparate when they saw the dark mark? Said Ron. They'd have been pleased to see it, wouldn't they? Use your brains, Ron, said Bill. If they really were Death Eaters, they'd worked hard to keep out of Azkaban when you-know-who lost power, and told all sorts of lies about him forcing them to kill and torture people. I bet they'd be even more frightened than the rest of us to see him come back. They denied they'd ever been involved with him when he lost his powers, and they went back to their daily lives. I don't reckon he'd be over-pleased with them, do you? Whoever conjured the dark mark, said Hermione slowly. Were they doing it to show support for Death Eaters, or to scare them away? Your guess is as good as ours, Hermione, said Mr. Weasley. But I'll tell you this. It was only the Death Eaters who ever knew how to conjure it. I'd be very surprised if the person who had done it hadn't been a Death Eater once, even if they're not now. Listen, it's very late, and if your mother hears what happened, she'll be worried sick. We'll get a few more hours of sleep, and then try to get an early port key out of here. Harry got back into his bunk, and with his head buzzing, he knew he ought to feel exhausted. It was nearly 3 a.m, but he felt wide awake and worried. 3 days ago it felt much longer, but it had only been 3 days. He'd awoken with his scar burning, and tonight, for the first time in 13 years, Lord Voldemort's mark had appeared in the sky. What did these things mean? He thought of the letter he had written to Sirius before leaving Privet Drive. Would Sirius have got it yet? When would he reply? Harry lay up, looking at the canvas, but no flying fantasies came to him now to ease him to sleep, and it was a long time after Charlie's snores filled the tent that Harry finally dozed off. Okay, I'm going to stop it there at Chapter 9. We finished that today. Tomorrow we're going to start Chapter 10, which is Mayhem at the Ministry. I want you guys to make your predictions. Who do you think were the Death Eaters that night, and who do you think conjured the dark mark? We'll find out more tomorrow. See you later.